Meg woke up when she heard a knock on the door. She jerked up in bed and saw Cruz standing in the doorway between the two rooms, a coffee cup in hand. He was dressed in a fresh shirt and cargo shorts, and his hair was still damp. "What time is it?" she asked. "7, he said, his voice husky. "You slept in your dress?" Cruz Montoya was one of the sexiest men to walk the planet, and he turned her on. Always, still. And there was no way in hell she was letting him know that, and double no way that she was going to act upon it. So she'd gone to bed with the only armor she had. "I thought the room might be chilly." "You can always turn down the air conditioning," he said. "Whatever, I better get dressed." "Coffee?" he said. "I just made a second pot." Cruz loved coffee and drank way more than he should. On the weekends, it hadn't been unusual that he'd get through 2 pots before she ever poked her head out of the bedroom. "No thanks," she said. "What?" She'd given up coffee when she'd moved to Texas. The smell of it had kept too many memories fresh. "It bothers my stomach," she said. "Have you seen a doctor?" he asked, sounding concerned. So that he could tell me, "Good job? Drinking coffee is a vice, not a virtue." Cruz rolled his eyes. "Once you get showered and dressed, I'll walk you to your office. By the way, I called your boss early this morning." "Why?" "'Cause we're buddies." She rolled her eyes this time. "Because I wanted him to know what happened on the Riverwalk. I suggested that he assign a security guard outside your office. He said to consider it done. Do you really think that's necessary?" "I wouldn't have asked if I didn't." She wanted to argue that it was a waste of resource, but knew it was probably useless. Cruz had convinced Scott, and there was no way she could persuade both of them. "Then what are your plans?" "I'm going to track down Mason Hawkins, Tom Looney, and Troy Blakely." She'd known Hawkins and Looney pretty well. They'd been at their jobs when she'd gotten hired. She knew Blakely less well. He'd come a couple months after her, and his tenure had been short. She'd had no bad interactions with any of the men, hadn't even been there when they'd been fired. Yes, she was administration, but surely that wasn't enough for one of them to hate her. But somebody did. If it wasn't hate, it was something close. The only person who really had a reason to hate her was Cruz, and she knew he was innocent. Well, Cruz wasn't the only person. It was crazy to think that this had something to do with what had happened in Mater, but she couldn't afford to be stupid about it. She was definitely going to need to talk with Detective Myers about what had happened 20 years ago. "What are you going to say to Hawkins, Looney, and Blakely if you find them?" "When, not if," he said. "I'll find them, and I'll have a reasonable conversation with them unless I think they're involved in this. Then I'm going to start cracking heads." "Cruz," she warned, "Detective Myers made it clear. He's the investigator on this case, not you." "Then he better stick close to my heels," Cruz said. He backed away from the doorway. "Knock when you're ready." He pulled the door halfway shut, and Meg heard the television click on. She got out of bed, pulled the tags off her new underwear, and grabbed a freshly dry-cleaned suit. She carried everything into the bathroom with her. 30 minutes later, she knocked on the adjoining door. Cruz didn't even look startled at the interruption, and she had the sense that no matter how quiet she'd been in her room, that he'd heard and tracked every movement. He saw too much. It made it even more important that she hide her thoughts from him. "That's a nice color on you," he said, looking at her peach suit. "Thank you," she said. She couldn't remember Cruz ever saying anything about her clothes. He'd always just let his eyes do the talking. Heat, awareness, want. This felt awkward, maybe because it seemed awkward for Cruz, like he was saying it because he should, and Cruz never did or said anything just because he was supposed to. They left the room and walked toward the elevator. "You gonna eat breakfast?" he asked. "We keep some fruit and bagels in the executive break area. I'll just grab something later. If you're hungry, several places along the Riverwalk serve breakfast. Plus, there are more choices up on the street level." "I'll figure something out," he said. When they got to her office door, she saw Tim Burtis sitting on a chair outside the door. He stood up when he saw them. "Good morning, Meg," the man said. "Hi, Tim." She turned to Cruz. This is Security Officer Tim Brutus. Tim was our Associate of the Month in January. Tim, this is my ex-husband, Cruz Montoya. Cruz shook the young man's hand. Tim was practically beaming, and Meg was happy that she'd been able to slip in something about his recent recognition. Not only did it make the young man feel good, but hopefully it would also send a subtle message to Cruz that this was one of the hotel's best security guards. He didn't need to worry. It must have worked, because Cruz didn't ask him about his experience, to drop and give him 20, or to demonstrate that he knew how to use the baton that was clipped to his belt. All he said was, "I need to touch base with Meg's secretary and then we can talk." Great, he wanted to meet Charlotte, which would prompt the woman to ask about 100 questions, and she'd have answers for none of them. Meg opened the door. Charlotte sat at her desk, a coffee cup in one hand, a telephone in the other. She looked at Meg, looked at Cruz, and told the person that she'd have to return the call. She put the telephone down with a soft thud. "Good morning, Charlotte," Meg said. She took a deep breath. "I want to introduce you to Cruz Montoya, my ex-husband. Cruz, this is Charlotte Anderson." To Charlotte's credit, she showed almost no reaction to learning that her boss had been married, but had never mentioned it. Perhaps her lip quivered just a little, and her eyes widened, but other than that, she was the perfect example of professional control, as always. "Mr. Montoya," she said, "it's a pleasure to meet you." Cruz is a police officer in Chicago and has been in contact with Detective Myers regarding the incidents. Meg shifted her attention to Cruz. "Charlotte is aware of the telephone call, the note, and the damage to my car and apartment. She deliberately didn't mention the Riverwalk shove and was grateful when Cruz didn't either." "Charlotte pulled together the list of names that you reviewed," Meg added. "Thanks," Cruz said. "Security Officer Tim Brutus is going to be sitting outside the door. He's going to need to know who is expected. Can you work with him on that?" "Of course. Anything to keep Meg safe." "Great. Here's my cell number in case you need to reach me." He reached for a yellow sticky pad on Charlotte's desk and scribbled down the number. He turned to leave and Meg followed him. Tim Brutus stood up again. Charlotte nodded at him. "Charlotte will touch base with you on who is expected today. Nobody gets past you." "Yes, sir." "Don't let her leave. If she tries to, tackle her," Cruz said. The young officer looked at Meg and the tips of his ears got pink. "He's kidding," she said. "Only a little," Cruz responded. He turned toward her. "Be smart, Meg, please." She was going to be in her office with a guard. Cruz was the one who was going to be out, asking questions, maybe making people uncomfortable. He was the one who needed to be careful. She put her arm out, touched his shoulder. He jerked back. Had he felt the heat, the spark of connection? "Right back at you," she said, knowing it was lame. But the need to touch, the need to hold him tight, was almost overbearing.